Okay, so good morning. So we've been going through, we're on in the Gemara, Beitzah, Masechet Beitzah, Daf Yud Chet, Amud Bet. Right, yesterday we were going through the final, the all four explanations really of why it is that we cannot tovel kelim on Yom Tov. Right, we saw the first one that we discussed previously was Rabbah, who said that we're worried about Shemay Avereno Abamot B'Reshut Rabim, where you're going to come and you're going to carry on Shabbat and on Yom Tov, but you're going to come and you're going to carry the kelim for Amot and Reshut Rabim and violate the Yisur of Hotza'ah. Okay, and therefore there was a Gzerah of Yom Tov Atu Shabbat. That was explanation number one. Explanation number two that we saw yesterday was Rav Yosef. Right, Rav Yosef said we had a Gzerah, Shema Yeshet. This is all on Amud Aleph, right? Rav Yosef says Gzerah Mishum Schita. Rav Yosef says we're worried that you're going to come and you're going to squeeze out the water. Right, we said we could ask the same questions we asked in Rabbah, we could ask in Rav Yosef, but we could give the same answers. The Gemara just did a copy paste over there. Then answer number three was Rav Bibi, right? Rav Bibi said, Gzerah Shemayash He. Rav Bibi says, we are concerned that you are going to keep the kelim that are tameh, you're going to refrain from tovling them until Yom Tov, right? You're going to wait, Shemayash He, you're going to delay in that, and then you're going to end up with the tameh kelim in your house, and then you're going to make everything tameh, and that's going to cause a big takala. So therefore, do it before Yom Tov, you're not allowed to tovel on Yom Tov. That was answer number three. And answer number four, the last one was Rava. Right, Rava said, Rava said, it looks like you are being metaken kli, like you are fixing something. Right? Beforehand, you couldn't use this kli, now you can use it. And therefore, it looks like metaken. And from there, we get into a discussion about Tvilat Adam. Right, if it's the case that it's going to look like metaken kli when you are toveling the kelim, so the same thing should apply when a person goes to the mikveh himself. Right, let's maybe pick it up from there. We are on Daf Yud Chet Amud Aleph near the bottom. Got four lines on the bottom. Rava Amam Ibnei Shnei Metaken Kli. Right, so we said Ihachi Adam Nami. The same thing would apply to a person. Right, beforehand the person was tameh. They needed to go to the mikveh. Now they've gone. They've fixed themselves, so to speak. But it's only near Metaken Kli. So says the Gemara, Adam near Mekar. A person is allowed to go into the mikveh because you could say, not necessarily going in for toveling, but a person's going in to cool themselves, right? That's what it looks like. So we said that works if it is good water, but what if it's dirty water, right? So then, sometimes a person comes, it's very, very hot, they don't care what water, they just want to go and cool down. Okay. That works in the summer when it's very hot. What are you going to say in the winter? What are you going to say when it's raining? So then we said, okay, so sometimes a person comes and they're very dirty. They've gone through the mud or whatever it is, and they want to wash themselves, even wash that off, even if it's cold. Okay, so Teinach b'Shabbat, Yom Kippur ma'ikalamim. Now the final question here is, that works on Shabbat, but what about on Yom Kippur? So he said, Amarava, mi kamidi b'Shabbat shali of Yom Kippurim aso. We said, when it comes to the Yisur of Melacha, anything that's going to be forbidden because of Melacha, all right, or the Rabbanan, right, that is going to be, if it's allowed, if it's permitted on Shabbat, it's going to be permitted on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, we have a separate issue of Inuyim, but that's not what we are discussing over here. Okay, and from here, the Gemara is going to get into a discussion about Rava's opinion, which we saw briefly yesterday. We'll see some more today. But before we do that, I just want to have a look at some of the practical halacha that comes out of this, because it's very, very interesting. A sugya, and very, very relevant sugya in terms of tefillah. Sometimes maybe on Yom Tov, a person wants to go into the mikveh, etc., or tvilat kelim. So let's have a look what the Shulchan Aruch says over here. Okay, you should be able to see it now. So first of all, it's interesting. There is a Mishnah which we say every week, which references this idea, right? The Shulchan Aruch brings it in Reish Samech Aleph, but it's from the end of Bameh Madlikin, right? It says safek, put it in big. Okay, safek chashecha v'ben hashmashot, ein maslin et avadai, ve'ein matbilin et hakelim, ve'ein malikin et hanelot. Right? That's the Mishnah end of Bamei Malikin. We say when we get to safek chashecha, it's ben hashmashot, so it's between sunset and nightfall. So that is the time. Certain things to Rabbanan, for the sake of a mitzvah, you may still be allowed to do them. But we say, Ein Masrin Tavadai, we don't separate Trumot and Masr of something which is Vadai, as opposed to Dmai, as opposed to something which is, there's a fake about it, where you could still separate. The Ein Matbilin Takelim, right? We see already here, says the Mishnah, says the Shulchan Aruch as well, Ein Matbilin Takelim, we cannot toivel Kelim, already from Ben Hashmashot. Which Tvilah is that referring to? Is that referring to the tefillah that Gemara is talking about, or the tefillah nowadays? Says the Mishnah Bra, Ein Matbilin, Machaber Atik Lashon Mishnah, right? The Shulchan Aruch over here quoted the Mishnah, Af she'en noheg ata, even though nowadays this is not relevant. The Mishnah, Ayri le'inyan natbil kelim mitumatam. The Mishnah over there is talking about what our Gemara is talking about. We have kelim tmeim. Can you have the tefillah or not? However, why does the Shulchan Aruch still bring it? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Mishum de nafkamina mizel didan. There is still a practical ramification for us. Linyan tvilat kelim chadashim anichim mina eno yodi. Right, because it would still apply. In other words, tvilat kelim. We have a different type of tvilat kelim nowadays, which we still do. And he says, ledat haoslim latbilam b'Shabbat. As we'll see in Siman Shin Kaf Gimel, asonami ledidu latbilan ben hashmashot. Okay, and he's telling you over here that for those who say that it's asur to toivel kelim on Shabbat nowadays, would say it's already asur ben hashmashot. And the reason, that time, the mishum denerekem metaken kli. That's Rava's reason, right? Because it looks like you are metaken kli. Talidat tefillah mutar l'shtamesh ba. Through the tefillah, you can now use it. Ach im tzarich l'Shabbat ve'ein lo acher. So the Mishnah Berurah says at the end of the day, he says if it's the only kli you have for Shabbat, you don't have another one, you could do the tefillah actually ben hashmashot, right? And that would be okay. So again, what does all this depend on? Whether you can do the tefillah on Shabbat or not. So Gemara clearly says you cannot do tefillah on Shabbat, but Gemara is talking about tefillat kelim from tum'ah to ta'ara. Our tefillah is different, and as we mentioned yesterday, it would depend on which of the four reasons that we accept, which of the four reasons we accept as to whether it would be permitted or not. So we'll see the Be'er Halacha in a moment. Let's just see. So the Shulchan Aruch in Shin Kaf Gimel, as he quoted. Let me put it up on screen for you. Okay, so says the Shulchan Aruch. He says here, you see in Sif Zayin, says, Mutar latbil kli chadash ata'on tefillah, ve'yesh oslim. Okay, so first of all, says the Shulchan Aruch, it's permitted. It says nowadays you can do tefillah on a new kli, which requires tefillah, ve'yesh oslim, and there are those who permit. So generally speaking, we have stam and yesh omrim, we paskin like stam. Okay, but the Shulchan Aruch is not so, he doesn't end there. He says, Yarei shamayim yetzed kulam. If you're a Shamayim, one who satisfy all the opinions, Yiteina kli le'eno yehudi b'matana v'yachzor v'yishalena mimeno v'en tzorich tvila. Okay, so he says you should. Again, our situation is I've come into a situation. We had all sorts of questions like this in England, for example. We go in Bnei Akiva Machaneh. So you're out in some field in the middle of nowhere, and there's no mikveh, and you have a new kalim or something. What do you do? So he says that if you're a Yerei Shemaim, you want to satisfy everybody's opinions, because there are those who forbid one from doing the tefillah on Shabbat. So best to give it to a non-Jew and borrow it from them, and then it would not require tefillah. Now this heter, by the way, this is something. I mean, this is discussed quite extensively in the poskim. Nowadays, we have all sorts of kelim, electrical devices or different types of kelim which are very, very difficult to toivel. Right? If you ever tried to toivel, I don't know, a kettle or a toaster or things like that, So you know what can happen on the other side sometimes. Sometimes there are those the old simple appliances where you put them in water, you leave them out long enough to dry, and then they'll be fine. But some of the more advanced technological things, you can't really put them in water. So it's a big discussion as to what should be done. How do we get by Tfilat Kelim? One of the options that's given, one of the things the poskim discuss, is that the Tfilah is only required if it belongs to a Jew. But if the Kli belongs to a non-Jew and I'm only borrowing it from the non-Jew, right? So it's not actually my Kli, it's his Kli. So then it doesn't require Tfilah. So that's why nowadays lots of people, there are, the kettles and toasters and air fryers, I don't know what, but you lend it to a non-Jew, well, you give it to a non-Jew and then you borrow it back from them permanently. Okay, where does that come from? That comes from here. That comes from Al Siman. That comes from the idea. What's brought is that in a case, extenuating circumstances, in a case of Shabbat, where it's for one day, I'm not going to be able to toivel on Shabbat, so I give the kli to an non-Jew, and after Shabbat, I take it back from them, right? And then I go and toivel it. Is that meant to be a permanent thing? It's not meant to be a permanent thing. So that's why there are those who are mefakpek. There are those who question that heter if it's a permanent thing. The non-Jew doesn't really know who you are, doesn't really know what the appliance is. It's in your house. Okay, so maybe if there's no other way, and that's all you can do. But there are those who question that. But again, the basis for that heter is based on this idea of Shabbat, where, as we've seen, the Shulchan Aruch says there is a machloket, and there are those who say that you can't toivel on Shabbat, and therefore give it to the non-Jew and borrow back from them. Okay, what is this whole machloket based on? So as we've said, it's based on which are the reasons that we accept. And if you look in the Rishonim, it's interesting because some bring some of the reasons, some don't bring other reasons. Who do we paskin like? Do we paskin like Rabba? Do we paskin like Rav Bibi? Do we paskin like Rav Yosef? Do we paskin like Rava? That would be the difference. So says the Biur Halacha. There's a long Biur Halacha in Siman Shin Kaf Gimel. He says as follows. He says Mutar latbil v'yesh osrim. Says Tam elu shtei adayot hu b'mesechet beitza daf yud. That's our sugya, right? So everybody agrees that a kli tameh you cannot toivel on Yom Tov. And now he says, Natan Rabatam Gzera Shema Yaverenu Dardamot Bershut Rabim Gzera Yom Tov Atu Shabbat. Right? Rabba says we're worried you're going to come and carry, and it's a Gzera of Yom Tov Atu Shabbat. That was reason number one. Reason number two, Rav Yosef Amatam Shema Yischot. V'gazrinan kelim delav b'nei schita atu kelim b'nei schita. Okay. Rav Bibi natantam shema yasheakli milat tavlo ad zman Yom Tov v'Shabbat shupanoi lo melacha. You're going to wait until Shabbos and Yom Tov when you are free, when you have free time. You don't have any melacha. You're not bothered by your emails and your WhatsApps, right? Ve'avon edei takala. Sheishkach v'shtamesh bo truma kodem tefillah, and you're going to end up using the kli that's tameh for truma. V'Rava natan tam d'nerekim utaken kli. Okay. Now, when we get into the Rishonim, we get into the Rif, who comes to the back of the Gemara, and he quotes the Gemara, but he only brings those parts which are relevant halacha lemaaseh, or if it's not relevant halacha lemaaseh, and he quotes a machloket, then he'll say who the halacha is like. If you open up the Rif, you'll see Harif avi rak tam Rav Yosef. V'tam Rav Bibi. Okay? The Rif only writes the reason, he doesn't bring the reason of Rabba or of Rava. He only brings the reason of Shema Yischot and Shema Yasher. Now those reasons apply only to Kelim when I'm talking about Kelim Tmeim, not when I'm talking about what we have nowadays. So says the Balachami Meile, if those are the only reasons that are applied to halacha, so nowadays you could toivel a new kli on Shabbat. Nowadays, there's no new kli that you have to toivel that you could do schita on. Right? You can't do schita on your pots and pans. וגם שמא ישהה ליקה למימא דווקא בכלי טמא אם ישנו וישתמש בו תרומה ויאכלנו אביד איסור. Right? And also, when it comes to this idea of Shema Yisheh, nowadays we don't have Kli Tamei, nowadays we don't eat Truma, right? So there would be no problem there. And therefore, so skipping a little bit, okay, right? So it says the Biur Halacha, Lachen la'arif mutar latbil kli chadash So according to the Rif, it's only those two reasons which no longer apply nowadays, which is the reason why you can't toivel a kli on Shabbat, and therefore nowadays would be allowed. However, not everybody agrees, as you know, because we already saw in the Shulchan Aruch that it's machloket. So he says, I've just lost my mouse. There it is. Okay, aval harosh pasakat amad Rabba v'Rava. So the Rosh says exactly the opposite. The Rosh says we paskin like the first and the last reason. And those reasons very much do apply today. Right? If we're worried about carrying, or we're worried about that it's nirekim etaken kli. The truth is that the Rosh is more, at least at first glance, much more readily understandable, because the Gzerah of Rabbah about Shema Yaverno Daled Amot Bereshut Rabim, that's a Gzerah that we see throughout Shas, and it's a Gzerah that we paskin like everywhere else, right? By Shofar, by Lulav, by Megillah. So why wouldn't paskin like it here? Okay, so therefore he says. Be'alacha goes on. He adds something. He says, "Afilu klei zchuchit tetvilata lekule alma hu rak midrabanan." Right, glass utensils. It's only midrabanan that you have to do tefillah. He says, "Gam ken asur." So you might have thought, well, if it's tefillah drabanan, so then again it's a question of gzera ligzera. So he says, "Gam ken asur la yesh osrim mazeh ken gadvar achronim." Right, even though that would also be forbidden. Okay, so bottom line is we have over here, you see, we have a machloket between the Rosh and the Rif as to which of the reasons that are brought in the Gemara are the ones that are paskin to halacha. The middle two reasons, which the Rif says, are the ones which apply, which we paskin like, and therefore that would not apply today. And today you'd be allowed to toivel kelim on Shabbat. The Rosh says no, it's the first and the last reason which apply equally today, and therefore you would not be able to. So therefore the Shulchan Aruch said you're allowed to, like the Rif, but yesh osrim, and it's better to follow the stringent opinion. Okay, what about Tfilat Adam? Is a person allowed to go and toivel into the mikvah on Shabbat and Yom Tov? So we saw the reasoning of Shema that it's nireka meikar. That at the end of the day, it looks like a person is going to cool off, and we could always explain it that way, and therefore there would not be an isur to go into the mikvah. Shulchan Aruch discusses this in Siman Shin Kaf Vav. So the Shulchan Aruch brings us all the din about washing on Shabbat as well. Right, this would be related to the sugya of whether one's allowed to wash on Shabbat, right? Or on Yom Tov. But in any event, regarding the mikvah specifically, he says Adam mutar litbor mitumato b'Shabbat. Says Shulchan Aruch, a person could go into the mikvah on Shabbat. Question is that nowadays as well? So it says the Mishnah Berurah, Rotzeh lomar, Alf agav the kli asur latpilo l'taro mitumato b'Shabbat v'Yom Tov nev shenireh kemetaken kli. Right, as we've explained, like Rava, that you can't toivel the kli on Shabbat and Yom Tov because it looks like you are fixing the kli. Adam shani, person is different. He looks like he is cooling himself off, washing himself off in the water. Right, the Mishnah Berurah explaining here what we said in the Gemara. Even if right now it's cold or the water's dirty and you wouldn't normally wash in them, nonetheless, מכל מקום לפעמים כשאדם בא בין הדרך, מלוכלך בטיט וצורה, הדרך לרחוץ, אף באלו ועל כן מותר אפילו היה יכול לטבול קודם שבת. And therefore, he says it would be allowed. Okay, the poskim do talk about that nowadays it's brought down in some of the Rishonei Ashkenaz and some of the Achronim as well, that there is a minhag not to wash even on Shabbat, not to wash oneself even in cold water because of various concerns. But it would seem that in terms of the mikveh, that would be separate, and that would be that seems to be permitted. Okay, so let's go back into the Gemara. So we said, so at the end of the day, we asked about Rava, was about his reasoning, and we said that Hoel, right? Hoel b'Shabbat shari b'Yom Kippurim nami shari. If it's allowed on Shabbat mitzad melacha, on Yom Kippur it's also going to be allowed mitzad melacha. And then the Gemara asks, right, we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines down from the top of Yud Chet Amud Bet. right? Mi itle Rava hoel. Does Rava really say that since it's allowed in case A, it's also going to be allowed in case B? Vatnan, well, we have a Mishnah regarding medicine on Shabbat. Vatnan choshesh b'shinav lo yigma ben et hachometz. A person who has a toothache on Shabbat, they cannot go now and gargle vinegar. However, they can dip their food in vinegar and eat, because that looks like they're just eating normally. And if they're healed, they're healed. And then we say a contradiction. We challenge that from the following Braita. Lo yigma v'polet, aval megameu bolea. One may not gargle and spit it out, but one can gargle and swallow. So the first one, the Mishnah said, you cannot gargle at all. Then we said, you can gargle so long as you swallow. So that's a contradiction. So Abaye says, no, there's no contradiction, because our Mishnah also means if you gargle and spit it out. But that's not the, but which we said afterwards also would be forbidden. But it's only if you gargle and swallow that would be allowed, according to everybody. However, Rava gave a different answer. Rava Amar, afilu megamel bolei, says, no, the Mishnah is talking there where you gargle and you swallow. Velo kasha, but there's no contradiction. Kan kodem tibur, kan leachar tibur. Right? It's whether it's before or after you've eaten. Before you've eaten, then you're allowed to. After you've eaten, it would not, you would not be allowed to, because you've already eaten and dipped your food in vinegar. And therefore, if you're now going and swallowing the vinegar or even spitting it out, that would show that you're doing it for the sake of medicine. But the point is that we said, doesn't Rava say the principle of Hoel? Doesn't Rava say if it's allowed in case A, it's going to be allowed in case B? So if we say, the question is, are you allowed to gargle vinegar on Shabbat or not? If you say you can, then you can. And if you say you can't, you can't. But Rava, you're saying you can if it's before the meal, but you can't if it's after the meal. Why don't you say, since it's allowed after the meal, it's allowed before the meal also? That's exactly the same as what we said before by Shabbat and Yom Kippur. Right? Im ita neima hoil v'kodim tibur shali lachar tibur nami shali. You should have said if it's allowed before, then it's also going to be allowed after. So says the Gemara, Hada be Rava mehai. So now Rava actually changed his mind, and he retracted his opinion regarding that. Right. So Rashi says over there, he says on that Rashi a little bit further down, he says Hada be Rava mehai. Rava retracted his opinion on that. The chometz, meaning he changed his mind on chometz. He didn't change his mind regarding Tvilat Kelim. Changed his mind here by the vinegar. V'shanyeh Abaye. He gave the answer of Abaye. That's the way he resolved the contradiction. V'tzot tefillah, the it lehoel amar lachar chazara. And this answer which he gave regarding tefillah, where we incorporate this principle of Hoel, so that Rava said later on, that he said after he had changed his mind previously about this case of the vinegar, right? Now says the Gemara, it's exactly the point. How do you know that? How do you know that he meaning the two stand in contradiction to one another? But how do you know that he changed his mind, revised his opinion regarding this case of the vinegar? Maybe he revised his opinion regarding the tefillah. So says the Gemara, lo sar kedatach. Do not think that. Don't let that thought into your mind. The Tanya, kol chayavei tefillot tovlin kedarkan ben b'tisha b'av ben b'yom kippurim. Because we have a braita that tells us that you're allowed to toivel. Anybody who's required tefillah should do so whenever it is, bein b'tisha b'av, bein b'yom kippurim. Okay, we'll just say that would not apply nowadays. That kol chayavei tefillot we're talking about of tumah and tara, right? Which nowadays does not apply. Nowadays, right, we have tefillat carry or different things, but it's not the same. It's not the same as not the same level, not the same requirement, and therefore nowadays there is no tefillah on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. However, theoretically, in the time when we are keeping Tumah and Tara, there would be. That is what it means. Okay, so that concludes that sugya, that section of the Gemara. We now go on to the next thing that we said in our Mishnah, which was Shavin shemeshikin et hamayim b'kli ever. We said that both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel agree that if you have a kli even tahor, which you could bring in water, which is tameh, right? You would have to do this in a kli even, because kli even is not makabel tuma, right? That's the point. But you would bring the water that is inside. The water itself is tameh, and when it comes into contact with the water in the mikveh, that water would become tahor. Right, so our Mishnah said, "Shavin shemishikin tamayim b'kli even atalan." If you have a look back at Yud Zayin Amud Bet at the bottom, right in the Mishnah, we said, "Shavin beit shamayim beihila mishikin tamayim b'kli even atalan." You can do hashaka in order to to make this water tahor. However, avalo matbilin, but you could not matbilin. In other words, if you bring a kli, the kli itself is tameh, and you're going to say, I'm going to bring the kli that's tameh, and I've got the water inside that's tameh, and I'm going to bring it all into the mikveh. No, we said you can't tovel the kli. So you can have a kli which itself does not get become tameh with the water inside, and that you can do. But to tovel the kli itself, you can't. So now says the Gemara, so it says, my avalo matbilin. Right? Amar Shmuel ein matbilin et hakli al gav meimav l'taro b'yom tov. So that's the point. Don't think now because you can come and you can be tovel you can do hashakah of the water. Don't think that since I'm going to do hashakah of the water, I can, by the by, go and tovel the kli itself. That is not allowed. That is not allowed. Now the question is, which opinion does this follow? Which opinion does our Mishnah follow? It says, Mani manitin, lo Rebbe velo Rabbanan. We're going to see at the beginning, it seems difficult. It does not seem to work with the opinion of Rebbe or the opinion of Rabbanan, because we have the following braita. Tanya, ein matbilin et hakli agav meimav l'taro, ve'ein mashikin et hamayim b'kli even l'taro, divrei Rebbe. V'chachamim omrim, matbilin kli agav meimav l'taro, u'mashikin et hamayim b'kli even l'taro. Okay, we have a braita that says we have machloket between Rebbe and Rabbanan. One says, but what you see is both Rebbe and Rabbanan group hashaka and hatpala together. Right? The one who says that you can do hashaka on the water on Yom Tov says that you can tovel the kli as well. The one who says you can't tovel the kli says you can't do hashaka. Our Mishnah says you can do hashaka, but you can't tovel the kli. So at first glance, it would appear that our Mishnah does not correspond neither to Rebbe nor to Rabbanan. Okay, so we have to see different resolutions, exactly how the Gemara will get around that, and that will conclude, that will take us, I think, to the next Mishnah as well. Ad kan for today. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.